because a surprising number of people, quite independently of each other, have started to write about Greek myths. And I think it's because we are so bombarded with stories. There's 5 or 6 different stories every night, just on the television. But they come and they go, and they don't always make a lasting impression on you. And I think there's a sort of hunger for stories that have stood the test of time, that have meant something to succeed in generations, not just for hundreds of years now, but for thousands of years.
Gosh, it's lovely to see real-life human beings in the audience. Welcome to this event sponsored by the National Library of Scotland here at the Edinburgh International Book Festival. I'm Lee Randall, and it is my great privilege to be talking today to Pat Barker. I'm going to do the housekeeping first, get the place nice and tidy before we begin. So for anyone watching online right now or in the future, just want to remind you that the festival has adopted a pay-what-you-can model. So we'd be immensely grateful if you're able to pay for a ticket or make a donation to help the festival keep on keeping on. And if you've already purchased the ticket, thanks very, very much. Another important way to support the festival and all of its authors is by visiting their independent online bookshop. And let me remind everybody here today that Pat will be signing books afterwards in the special signing tent. And I highly recommend getting hold of this book, which isn't even out yet. So this is the first sales opportunity. So let me introduce Pat Barker. Pat is the author of 16 best-selling novels, including the award-winning Regeneration Trilogy, and her most recent one, previous to this, The Silence of the Girls, which told the story of Briseis, and I apologize in advance for my shit ability with Greek, one of the forgotten women at the heart of an epic that's captivated our attention for thousands of years. Silence of the Girls was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Costa, the International Dublin Literary Award, and the Gordon Byrne Prize. It won an Independent Bookshop Award and was chosen as a Guardian Best Book of the 21st Century. Now, in a recent essay for The Guardian, Pat explained that these silenced girls are now emerging as formidable adults. In other words, the women of Troy. Now, as the story continues, Troy has fallen. The victorious Greeks are ready to go home with the spoils of war. But the wind they need to sail home does not come. The gods have been offended. The body of Priam lies desecrated and unburied, and so the victors remain camped at the edge of the sea in the shadow of a burning city they've destroyed. And as time passes, tensions mount, and the things that have been holding them together begin to crumble, and suspicion builds. Talking to Pat today with the events of Afghanistan unfolding, and especially what that means for women and children, feels especially moving to me personally. And while I didn't need reminding, it underscores the relevance and resonance of this story to our lives now. So welcome, Pat. What an honor to be here with you. And congratulations on the Women of Troy.
Oh, thank you. And thank you all for coming out in this dreadful weather. You are my first live audience since the start of the pandemic. So you can imagine. It is so good to see you. I'm just going to read a little bit right from the beginning of the book. And I start the story, where else? Inside the Trojan horse. And the speaker here is Pyrrhus, who was a very minor character indeed, in The Silence of the Girls. He is the son of Achilles, and he arrived in the Greek camp to fight the Trojans a week after his father died. So he has, in fact, never met his father, with all the problems that faces for a young man of just 16. Inside the horse's gut, heat, darkness, sweat, fear. They're crammed in, packed as tight as olives in a jar. He hates this contact with other bodies, always has. Even clean, sweet-smelling human flesh makes him want to puke. And these men stink. It might be better if they kept still, but they don't. Each man shifts from side to side, trying to ease his shoulders into a little more space, all intertwined and wriggling like worms in a horse's shite. Redworm. The word sends him spiraling down, down, down into the past, all the way back to his grandfather's house. As a boy, which is what some people seem to think he still is, he used to go down to the stables every morning, running along the path between the tall hedges, breath curdling the air, every bare twig glinting in the reddish light. Turning the bend, he would see poor old Rufus standing by the gate of the first paddock, leaning on it more like. He'd learnt to ride on Rufus, nearly everybody did, because Rufus was a quite exceptionally steady horse. The joke was, if you started to fall off, he'd stretch out a hoof and shove you back on. All his memories of learning to ride were happy, so he gave Rufus a good scratch, all the places he couldn't reach himself, then breathed into his nostrils, their breaths mingling to produce a snuffly, warm sound, the sound of safety. God, he'd loved that horse. More than his mother, more even than his nurse, who anyway had been taken away from him as soon as he was 7. Rufus, even the name had formed a bond. Rufus, Pyrrhus. Both names mean red, and there they were, the two of them, spectacularly red-haired, though admittedly in Rufus's case, the colour was more chestnut than auburn. When he was a young horse, his coat used to gleam like the first conkers in autumn. But of course he was older now, and ill. As long ago as last winter, a groom had said, "He's looking a bit ribby." And every month since then, he'd lost weight. Pelvic bones jutting out, sharp points to his shoulders. He was starting to look skeletal. Not even the lush grass of summer had put fat on his bones. One day, seeing a groom shoveling up a pile of loose droppings, Pyrrhus had asked, "Why is it like that?" "Redworm," the man said. "Poor old sod's riddled with them." Redworm. And that one word delivers him back to hell.
Oh, thank you, Pat. I have to ask, why do you think we don't get tired? These stories are thousands and thousands of years old. To me, they're very real. These people are as real as you and I. Why do you think these stories have held our imaginations and keep a hold of us?
Yes, I mean, it is very strange, isn't it? Because, you know, when I was doing the research for this, I thought, well, there are two pieces of information you can take for granted that everybody will know. One is that the Trojans had a horse, and the other is that Achilles had a heel. That's it, basically. And yet the stories are... The basic story of the Trojan horse is universally known. I was talking to a journalist on the radio who said that she couldn't remember a time when she didn't know the story of the Trojan horse. It went right back into her early years in primary school, and countless illustrations of it. And why do these stories go on appealing to people, go on, getting into people's imaginations? Well, they don't all, of course, because a lot of Greek myths are more or less defunct. But the ones that last have lasted into the present day. And why also has there been a recent resurgence of interest in writing about them? Because a surprising number of people, quite independently of each other, have started to write about Greek myths. And I think it's because we are so bombarded with stories. There's 5 or 6 different stories every night, just on the television. But they come and they go, and they don't always make a lasting impression on you. And I think there's a sort of hunger for stories that have stood the test of time, that have meant something to succeeding generations, not just for hundreds of years now, but for thousands of years. And those characters, as you say, are still very alive and are, in a way, unlike historical characters, they are still part of our world. I mean, Anne Boleyn or Elizabeth I is not going to walk into the 21st century, but Helen of Troy might. I mean, Helen of Troy walked into 16th century England, didn't she? Because there she was in the back room of a tavern in Cheapside, snogging Dr. Faustus. And no, she can do that. A historical character can't do that.
I find myself often thinking, why didn't they set fire to the horse? I found myself, I'm on page 1 of your book, and I start Googling pictures of the inside of the Trojan horse, which I'd never done before. And then I started thinking, why didn't they set fire to it? And I realized if they had set fire to it, Homer has no story. So from a literary standpoint, I get it. But again, because to me they're so real, I keep thinking.
Yes.
But you have Odysseus give a very specific reason why Priam and I think it's very relevant to what's going on in the world right now, why Priam brought the horse in through the gates.
Yes. Why let it through the gates? Well, there was a very plausible story being told about it, invented by Odysseus. But it leaves a bad taste, actually, because in the end, 10 years of fighting and heroism, and in the end, what actually won was trickery. It was a very dirty trick, the Trojan horse. But we still use it as a metaphor, don't we? Trojan horses, terrorists infiltrating the education system. That is spoken of as a Trojan horse.
And computer viruses, we've brought it right up to the 21st century. A computer virus is called a Trojan horse.
Oh, yes.
As well.
Condoms in America too, but that is no.
Yes. There's another thing that strikes me about this, and I wonder if you've got thoughts on this. There are so many instances of what I call stuckness. So on the beach at Aulis, the Greeks can't move. They're marooned there, and they have to sacrifice Agamemnon. Well, they don't have to, but Agamemnon chooses to sacrifice his daughter. And then, as you remind us in the book, they spend 9 years fighting over this one little bit of land outside Troy. And then they finally, as you say, trick them into letting them in. And then everything's won, and they're still stuck. Why? So what do you think Homer, what do you think the inventor of this story was trying to tell us with the stuckness?
Yes, it's a paradox, isn't it? You have all these extremely powerful men who, in the end, are not in control of anything. About 2/3 of the way through this book, I realized that I had all these people stuck together, many of them not liking each other very much, in this overcrowded area, which they want to get out of. They want to leave. They want to lead a normal life, and they can't because of some force that they can't see, can't control, which is saying, no, you shall stay in this place. And I suddenly realized I'm writing a lockdown book. And at that point, when you get this moment of revelation about something, you either rewrite to emphasize the lockdown thing, or you just think, yeah, well, it's only coincidence. And I decided it was only coincidence. But it must have colored the final draft of the book, because everybody's nerves are on edge. Everybody is having mental health issues because of this situation. And it's yet another link through to our world and our experience. And of course, with what's happening in Afghanistan, it's worse than that, because in The Silence of the Girls, there's a scene in which Briseis consoles a 12-year-old little girl who is going to be given in marriage in inverted commas, in sex slavery to one of the Greek fighters. And she's stroking this child's back and saying, there, never mind, it won't be so bad. And she knows all the time that it's going to be not just bad, but really terrible. And there must be mothers in Afghanistan whose 12-year-old daughters are being given to fighters who are saying exactly those things, who are stroking their daughters' backs and trying to console them. And here it is, still happening. And it's those echoes from the distant past to the present day are very chilling in a way.
Yeah.
Very chilling. But, you know, and people say, well, haven't we learned anything? You know, we don't seem to, human race doesn't seem to getting on or going anywhere. And you have to say, well, actually, it's not quite as bad as that, because we do have international law. I know it's often broken, but there are instances where people have committed war crimes and they've been arrested and taken to the International Court of Justice in The Hague and made to pay a penalty, whereas in the Bronze Age, anybody who had power was a law unto themselves. At least we have moved beyond that. So I'm more optimistic than you sometimes feel when you're looking at the news.
Yeah. So the story is told in 3 voices, from 3 perspectives. And I'd like to kind of get you to talk us through the 3 different characters. The first was Pyrrhus, is that?
Pyrrhus, yes.
Pyrrhus. As you say, where was he prior to pitching up in camp after Achilles was killed?
He was being brought up by his grandfather.
And they just sort of...
His mother's father, yes. And I don't believe Achilles ever married his mother. He is the only son of Achilles. I mean, that is amazing in itself, given the number of sex slaves. Yes, he's the son of Achilles. He's 16 years old. It's one of the instances in the myth where the myth doesn't make sense, because Achilles is throughout spoken of as a very young man. The emphasis is on how young Achilles is when he died. But given that he's got a 16-year-old son, he can't have been, you know, quite as young as Homer sometimes implies. And Pyrrhus his whole life is spent trying to be worthy of this man he never met, trying to be like this man he never met. And one of the sad things in the women of Troy, in fact, is that Achilles was a great musician. This is in Homer too. He played the lyre and he sang, and the lyre is still there, and it's a very beautiful instrument, and Pyrrhus can't play it, because nobody ever told Pyrrhus that music was important when it came to being like your father. He knew that killing loads of people was very, very important, so he's concentrated on that. But music is a closed book to him, so the lyre just stays there. He can't play it, won't let anybody else play it, so the lyre is completely voiceless.
Yeah, instead, he endlessly polishes his father's shield. And,
yes.
And there's a lot of things with reflections and mirrors, which I found very compelling. I know you found Achilles, with his various contradictions, very compelling. Was Pyrrhus ever as interesting to you?
Well, Pyrrhus is actually quite brutal, so it's difficult to regard him as... He's not an admirable character, certainly. It's difficult not to sympathize with him, because he's got this a mission in life at which he has no chance at all of succeeding. You cannot model yourself on a person you haven't met. And all he hears about Achilles is this superhuman courage that the man displayed, so that when he's in the Trojan horse and he's absolutely terrified, he feels that he's a total failure and he's unworthy of the blood in his veins, more or less.
Yeah. And then, of course, he murders Priam in a particularly
He murders Priam in a particularly
manner.
incompetent and brutal way. Yeah. And there's a scene in the throne room at which he has just butchered Priam. He was a very frail old man, can hardly stand up in his armor, it's weighing him down. Pyrrhus butchers him, and he notices that the women are watching, the women of the royal household. And being Pyrrhus, he runs towards them and shouts, "Boo!" And they scream and scatter, of course, except for one girl who stands up and looks him in the eye. And that is the girl whom we meet later. And she's a new character in this book.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many instances. The whole time I was reading the book, I kept thinking, this is a book about what we now call performing masculinity. I don't know what they called it in the Bronze Age. This idea of men who mistakenly believe that respect is their birthright rather than something to be earned. And then, so for him to perform this murder in this ridiculous way and then be witnessed by the women, it's such a moment of actually humiliation, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But he is humiliated too. And he doesn't initially, his one consolation, because he's made such a terrible job of it, is that the Greek fighters didn't see what a mess he made of it. And he thinks there were no witnesses because he doesn't think of the women as witnesses. The women are nothing. And then this girl, the girl who looks him in the eye and defies him, reveals that, yes, she did witness it, and she does despise him. Yeah. And the way he reacts to that is part of the story.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, because there's that moment where something happens. I don't want to spoil the unfolding of the story. And he says, well, who could have done it? There are only 2 Trojans in the whole camp, and all the Trojan women are standing there going, oh, I think you'll find.
Yes, yeah, that's right, yes. He suddenly realizes the camp is full of witnesses.
Yeah, full of Trojans.
Yes, yeah.
Let's talk about Briseis then. She's 19, I keep having to remind myself, she's only 19 years old.
She's 19 years old, but she's had quite an eventful 19 years in her life. And she's heavily pregnant now with Achilles' child. She's been in the camp some time, so she understands how you survive in this place. And then when Troy falls, there's an influx of very young girls, because Pyrrhus chooses who he wants from the captive women. And of course, he's 16 years old. He chooses girls his own age or slightly younger. So they are very young indeed, very shocked because they've witnessed terrible things. And Briseis sets out to help them. And this is another parallel with the present, because I have noticed sort of from Syrian refugees that the 2 things which become enormously important if you're in exile from your homeland the food of the homeland, food and sharing food and cooking from recipes that you've known all your life becomes very, very important. And the other thing that becomes important is the music of your homeland. It's like the Bible, by the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. And these women are being asked to sing, and they don't want to sing. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? But Briseis gets the girls together, she gets them cooking, and they have drums, they have a lyre, and they start singing the songs of their homeland. And she says, we don't want any sad songs, no sad songs, just choose cheerful songs. And they do, of course, but then she realizes that when you're in exile, all the songs of your homeland sound sad. So by the end of the evening, the girls are crying pretty much. But then it's not a bad thing that they are crying and reaching out to each other. It's enabling them to unpack all this horror, which has virtually reduced them to silence.
For me, the difference between the two books was very much that I felt like she was starting to get her mojo back a little bit. I felt that she was standing up a little straighter in this book, and I wondered...
Yeah, I think she's moving into a time where she can, to the extent that it's possible for her, she is seizing control again, because she was not a woman who lacked control or energy in her previous life. It's just that she was so utterly shocked by the destruction of her city and her home and her entire family. All vanished. And of course she was reduced to a state of muteness and just watching everybody in a state of fear, especially watching Achilles. But then in this book, she's much more mature, and she is ready to, as far as she can, cautiously defy them, defy the Greeks, and even to orchestrate a certain measure of revenge for what has happened to them.
Yeah. So when you were writing, did you start writing this book immediately after finishing The Silence of the Girls, or
Well, I can never really write until I've got the book before out.
Yeah.
I try and I produce something, but it doesn't always stand the test of time.
Yeah, I think I'm wondering, I heard her voice sort of change pitch, and I wondered if it was the same for you in your head as you were writing. Did her voice come through in a different way while you were writing this book?
Yes, possibly more, just possibly more mature, but the same ease. I mean, in a way, this has been, the last book and this book have been easy books to write, because I always had Briseis' voice. And even if I had to take a break, I went back, she was still there, and she was still prepared to talk to me. And it's not always like that, Sometimes you take a break from a novel and you go back to it, and it's just a plate full of cold porridge. It's really as horrible as that. And you can hardly believe that it's possible to get back into it. But I always had her there waiting for me, and that was great.
In both books, she talks about the fact that when they speak of me in the future, they will romanticize this. And I went around online, and there's so many places when you Google, her story. They talk about how she really loved Achilles and he really loved. I mean, honestly, Pat, what do you have to say about that?
I know, it drives you to despair, doesn't it? I remember talking to a gentleman who'd been in the audience, and he was convinced that Briseis was in love with Achilles. And I just said to him in the end, he burnt down her home, he killed her husband, he killed all 4 of her brothers. One of these deaths she witnessed at close hand. And women are really peculiar creatures. They tend not to fall in love with men who do that. And he said, oh, well, she was in love with Patroclus then. And I said, well, actually, she probably wasn't in love with anybody. She is surviving. And, love is given freely. It's not something that you are likely to be feeling as a slave.
Not unlike respect, which kind of brings me around to another really strong theme. I just quickly, before I move on to the third narrator, does her story continue anywhere in the literature? Or does she just walk out of the Iliad?
All we are told is that she was given to one of Achilles' chief aides. But I departed from that and made Achilles give her, on the condition of marriage, to one of his chief aides. So that, no, she's flying free at the moment. She's flying free of Homer. And she's pregnant. She's carrying Achilles' child. She's not at all sure that when it's born, she will be able to love that child. And that, for me, is a very interesting dilemma, because, of course, a lot of people think, well, oh, mother love will conquer everything. Of course you'll love it when it's actually born. But she, you know, she's thinking back as an old lady on what is her experience of life. And she knows that although that is usually true, it's not always true. There are children born of rape whom the mother simply cannot love. And those are very miserable children.
Mm. So your third narrator, help me with the pronunciation, Calchas?
Calchas. I don't know how it's pronounced either, but he's not going to come back and sue us.
We hope.
Calchas is, he's quite interesting. He's the chief priest of Apollo in the camp. He's Trojan by birth, and he remembers his childhood in Troy. And he is a strange person. He is, I have an awful feeling he would be called gender binary, wouldn't he? in present day, yeah. But he's to some extent he's based on the mythical character of Tiresias, who was neither male nor female, but actually both, and had access to the experience and the wisdom of both men and women simultaneously. So he's an interesting character.
But what's he doing for you? Why did you choose him as your third narrator?
What does he do for me? Partly, I think, I was groping for a sympathetic male character. I don't particularly like a situation where every woman who walks onto the page is a fine, upstanding specimen of humanity, and every man who walks on is more or less pretty awful. And there isn't a lot to choose from, because Agamemnon and Odysseus are very, very flawed characters. Yeah. And Calchas, although he's also got his own problems, he is, I think, something the reader can really sympathize with as well.
Yeah, I found him intriguing. I found him very intriguing, like what's going on in his head, and he's so he certainly worked on that level for me.
Yes, and he's a religious man, though I don't know how much of his faith is actually left. He became a priest of Apollo, essentially, because his father couldn't stand the sight of him, and his mother was sick of him being beaten up, and sending him to the temple to train to be a priest was the solution to the family's problems. And he becomes a rather scandalous figure at the court of King Priam, being chased equally by men and by women, and not running very hard to get away from either of them.
No.
So, yes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of somewhat sympathetic men, because I don't know enough about his backstory, but Priam, in both books, is hugely, hugely important. And I wondered how much he was, obviously he's there because he was there, put there by Homer, and he was the king of Troy. Yeah. But he also seemed to me to function as a moment where we asked ourselves, how much do we respect our elders, how much do we respect authority, and how much do we respect our dead?
Yes, yeah. He's a very sharp contrast with Achilles, because, Priam, he's presided over a prosperous city during a 50-year reign. He had a 50-year marriage, happy marriage, countless concubines, but that was expected of him. But there's no doubt of the depth of his respect and love for his wife Hecuba, or hers for him. So yes, he is a sort of moral. There are moral reference points in these books. Priam is one of them, and Achilles' great friend Patroclus is another. I don't think, some people say Patroclus is just a plot device. He's the reason Achilles, goes back into the fighting and exacts revenge. But he's more than that. He's the only truly compassionate person. He has compassion, he has loyalty, he has integrity, he has honor, and that makes him, in my mind, more than a plot device. He is the moral ground that Homer is standing on. And none of the other men are anything like that.
No. Could you talk about the idea of the guest friend? Because there's a moment where there's a legal moment in the book. And it hinges on the trip in the first book that Priam makes to the camp, where he humbles himself and he comes in to speak to Achilles about his son's body. And the guest friend premise from antiquity is really important in the women of Troy. I don't think everyone's going to know what it is.
I think it's Xenia, but since I don't speak Trojan, Greek, I'm not sure how you would say that. It's the idea that if somebody offers hospitality to another person, this forms an indelible bond. And it's where travel was dangerous, and to be taken into somebody's house and given hospitality, the bond between the person giving the hospitality and the guest receiving it is indissoluble. Once that's happened, you are bonded with that person. But not only that, but the bond then descends to your sons and even to your grandsons. And the whole thing kicks off, really, because Pyrrhus, the son of the king of Troy, is entertained by the Greek king, Menelaus, who then sort of wanders off to do something else. And while he's away, his guest, Pyrrhus, elopes with his wife or kidnaps her. Both stories exist. And so that is this terrible breach of guest friendship, which the Trojans, of course, which the Greeks resent and want to revenge. And that is the supposed genesis of the Trojan War. But also, in this book, it refers to the scene at the end of The Silence of the Girls when Priam comes to see Achilles and risking his life because he comes unarmed into the center of the Greek camp and Achilles receives him as a guest. And because of that, Pyrrhus, his Achilles' son, should also have revered Priam as his father's guest friend instead of hacking him to pieces in that incompetent manner.
And what intrigued me was this idea that the Greeks all bought into, was that suddenly in the midst of war, in the midst of this utter carnage, Priam's death is considered a murder. And I'm thinking, yes, they're all murdered. What are you talking about? But
the killing a guest friend is always murder. Even if you're on the battlefield with a battle raging all around you, you are not allowed to kill your guest friend or your fathers or your grandfathers. And there's an instance in Homer of two young men meeting on the battlefield, and in the way of Homer, they can't kill each other until they've exchanged their family histories. And they realized that their grandfathers were guest friends. And they just said, let us therefore avoid each other on the battlefield. And they're not blamed for this. They go away from each other without fighting. And yes, nobody blames them for it. Everybody accepts that that was the only thing they could do.
And with the desecration of Priam's body, with leaving it unburied, I was reminded of Antigone. So I'm guessing that was one of your sources when you were thinking about
I was aware that Amina is the girl who defies Pyrrhus in the opening two chapters. Yes, she is a person who is prepared to put the will of God, or the will of the gods, as she sees it, ahead of any human considerations. She's a totally uncompromising person who gets herself and, I'm afraid, other people into all kinds of danger because she is not prepared to compromise on doing what she believes to be the will of God.
Yeah. I've got a few more of my own questions that I'm going to be very greedy and ask, but think about your questions soon, because what we're going to do is we're going to take some questions from the digital viewers and in the room. But first I'm going to ask you, Helen. It's called Helen of Troy, although she's Spartan, if I know the story correctly.
It went back to being Helen of Sparta. Yes.
I've always found her an intriguing character. As you say, there are two versions of the story. Either she was abducted and raped, or she ran off in an adulterous, happy-clappy relationship with Pyrrhus.
And that's never sorted out whether she was raped or, because obviously the Greeks will never admit that she was raped and abducted. And nobody's listening to Helen, nobody's believing Helen. I mean, Helen produces total unity because everybody else in the books hates her. Both sides hate Helen. It's her fault. Oh. And it's interesting to me, you see, that the women are so keen on hating Helen and almost absolve the Greek kings who have laid waste to Troy. They don't blame the men. They blame the woman. It was all down to her.
Yes, which I think is highly unfair. I'm, like Briseis, I'm prepared to be friendly to Helen. I don't know why, but I know that they have a long-standing acquaintanceship and they get along. But what I want to know is about Pat. Would you ever write about Helen? Is she somebody who intrigues you enough to get the juices flowing?
Oh, I find it very difficult to identify wholly with a woman whose main problem is being so beautiful that everybody's jaw drops when she walks into a room. I think if women are honest, they find it very hard to identify with that.
Okay, so you're not.
The thing I do identify with Helen. She's a bit of a bitch. She doesn't say very nice things about the Trojan women, but then they say terrible things about her. But the thing she does is to weave the story of the Trojan War. So all the characters in Homer, the only one who is doing what Homer himself is doing, telling the story of the war, is Helen. And Briseis' sister says, well, these marvelous tapestries she's doing, she's not in them. Why doesn't she put herself into the tapestries? And Briseis' sister said, well, she doesn't know who's won yet, does she?
And finally, you've said in the past, in previous interviews, that you admire Homer's mind and that you think it was one mind. And I'm just curious why. Why do you admire, what is it you admire about Homer?
What do I admire in Helen?
Homer.
Oh, Homer. Compassion. It's what I always come down to admiring in people. As a writer, I think he is the most, he, she, it, or they, because, everybody agrees there wasn't just one person who produced the Iliad. But I do think that there are very strong signs that at some stage a single mind was at work, because there are times when Achilles reflects, the values of the epic poem are heroism and glory at all costs. And there's a point at which Achilles says, nothing is worth my life, and that is such a shocking thing to say in the context of this. And you just know that the mind that created Achilles was a single mind. A character as complex and deep as Achilles is not produced by a committee. Committees don't do anything very creative at all.
If you want to turn up the house lights. I will, while the roving mic goes to whoever gets the hand up fastest, I'll start off with, will there be a third book similar to your other trilogy?
Will there be a third book? Oh, God. I'm inclined to say 2 more.
2 more?
Yes, because I'm so sick of being the woman who writes trilogies, you see. So I'm going to say 4, probably.
Excellent. Well, that's great.
I am continuing with the story, I have to admit that. And the next book will have Cassandra as a major character.
Oh, brilliant, I love her.
Yes, oh, yes, I've already started that.
Oh, excellent.
I mean, Briseis doesn't particularly warm to Cassandra, but that doesn't matter, you know.
Yeah.
She doesn't warm to a lot of people, understandably. But, you know, Cassandra has her point of view. And you think of what's happened to Cassandra, where, you know, the god Apollo kissed her, gave her the gift of prophecy, then spat into her mouth when she wouldn't have sex with him, to make sure that none of her prophecies would ever be believed, although they would always be true. So this poor woman is warning her family, her city, and her people that Helen of Troy is going to bring them all to ruin. She sees Troy in flames. Can she get anybody to believe her and get rid of Helen? No, she can't. Nobody believes a word she says, no matter how hard she tries. You think about that, to always warn people, to always be telling the truth, but never to be believed. You know.
And also to foresee your own death so vividly, so viscerally.
Yeah.
I've always had a soft spot for Cassandra.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's an astonishing story. And, you know, I think, you know, to make her live for me, I've more or less made her bipolar, that, you know, in the manic side of her, what we would call her illness, but they call divine frenzy, she may well have had these conversations with Apollo. And, you know, is it a true story? Well, it's true in the sense that stories like that are true. Myths are true.
Yeah. Now, do we have somebody in the audience with a question? Oh, okay, there seems to be somebody right at the back. We'll go there first because I see the microphone's closest.
Can you repeat the questions, incidentally?
Thank you. At the beginning of the interview, you gave some indication that you were hopeful about the way in which we have learned the lessons of the past in terms of the rules of warfare. Do you feel similarly hopeful about learning the lessons of the past in terms of the role of women in warfare?
So at the beginning, we talked about whether or not we had learned the lessons of warfare during war. Do you feel similarly that about women's role in war? Do you think we've learned the lessons about women in war?
Well, towards the end, I read a book about the experiences of women in war, specifically the experience of rape. It's called, I don't know, I'm sorry, I can't remember. It's a pity because it's a very good book. But it is the only book I can say I have had to set aside for quite long periods because I felt that reading it was challenging my mental health too much. And I think we are lagging behind about the experience of rape in warfare. And the way in which the women who suffer this are sometimes rejected by the communities they try to go back. I think, no, I think we've only just started to learn about that.
There's somebody with a burgundy sort of shirt. Have you got the...
Hello. I wondered if in your research for your book and the forthcoming books, you're using any of the material in Virgil's the Aeneid.
Are you using the Aeneid at all as a source?
Mainly the Aeneid, actually. Sorry, not mainly the Aeneid, mainly the Iliad, but yes, I did, particularly in the first 2 chapters of this, which is, the Aeneid is interesting because, of course, the Trojans are the heroes, and Pyrrhus in that is a villain, and so that was interesting. But the description of the fall of Troy in the Aeneid is an amazing description.
I went back and read book 2 when I was prepping for this, and the description of the Trojans wandering around the Greek camp like it's a tourist attraction.
Yes.
I hadn't remembered that from when I read it at university. That really struck me.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Let me ask you another one from one of our online viewers. How do you strike a balance between imagining your own interpretation of the stories and remaining true to the original sources?
Well, there is so little about the women in the Iliad that it's not really as much as a problem as you might think. The women have to be imagined because they're not there in any meaningful sense. And how do you strike a balance between faithfulness to the original sources? Well, I don't want to just repeat. For example, the battlefield scenes are incredible, horrific. Homer, he might not have known what kidneys or brains or lungs or intestines were for, but he knew where they were and he knew what they looked like. And that knowledge can only have been achieved on a battlefield. He didn't go to art school and study anatomy. He didn't go to medical school. The way in which you see organs like that is on a battlefield. And the descriptions are so graphic. And I thought, well, I don't want to just repeat this. And so I decided that I would give the details of the deaths and the names of the people the men who were being killed, but I would immediately switch to their mothers' stories, and their mothers remember this young man as he was when he was a baby, or sometimes, did he walk early, did he talk early? Sometimes they remember their labors. So you acknowledge the horror of the battlefield, but you also deepen it, in a sense, I hope, by dealing with the lifelong losses of the mothers whose sons were killed trying to defend Troy.
Have we got another question here in the audience? In the physical audience, because I know we have a lovely digital audience. No, here's somebody over here. Wait till the mic gets to you.
Apologies if everyone knows this answer. I've only read Silence of the Girls, but have you considered writing for a younger audience in that your storytelling is absolutely captivating, and I think perhaps Silence of the Girls is a bit graphic, but that's maybe my sensitivities. But if you could share your skills with a younger audience.
Given your skills at storytelling, would you ever consider writing stories that are perhaps less graphic for younger readers? Would you write for younger readers generally?
I suppose the answer is I never have done. I would expect girls of 14, 15, 16, and boys too, not that boys read at that age, but I would expect them to be able to tackle the Silence of the Girls, yes. I've got a 12-year-old granddaughter, and I am sometimes quite horrified by what they know and what they experience, and I think we all underestimate it.
I'm going to ask one last question from the online audience. Do you have a favorite character in the whole saga?
A favorite character in
this whole saga?
Oh, I think Briseis herself is my favorite character, yes. Yes, I mean, there are minor characters like Thersites, who is so horrible. It's very interesting to me that Thersites, who is oh God, he's covered in boils, he's a really nasty person. And in Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare more or less takes that character and makes him the central character. And Shakespeare must have been having a really down, cynical, disillusioned period when you take him and make him the central character in the saga of the Trojan War.
But it is, I mean, you hear actors say this all the time. It's sometimes much more fun to be the villain than the hero, isn't it? There's much more to sink your teeth into. And I imagine for a writer, that must be similar.
Yes, I don't think I've written from the point of view of any of the villains in this. I mean, the closest I've come is Pyrrhus, who is fairly villainous. But I don't really write from the point of view of Odysseus, who is so clever, and such a liar.
But
I do love the way in which, he's asked to introduce himself in the Odyssey, and the first thing he says about himself is, "I am a liar," which is, it's a sort of logical dilemma. If it's true, it's false. If it's false, it's true.
As this session closes, I'm going to mention two things. Pat was once told that books with O in the title sell well in bookshops because the O is like little eyes looking out at you.
Oh, yes, that's right, yes.
So there are 3 O's in the title.
Yes,
Let's make this a bestseller. Let's make this a bestseller.
Yes, I mean, the best comment on my ridiculous thing about, 2 O's in the title that catches people's attention was from a Sunday Times journalist who said, "Oh, yes, like those well-known novels, Oliver Twist and Mansfield Park."
I challenge you all to whisk this out of the bookshop and turn it into a bestseller. Pat, if you'll give us an opportunity to get off stage safely, Pat will be whisked over to the signing tent where you can get a personally inscribed book. But before we all go, and thank you everyone who's watching digitally as well, please, can we just thank Pat for being here with us?